Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything. Geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this show here at American Freedom Radio, AmericanFreedomRadio.com, as well as on my website, which is PorkinsPolicyReview.com. And, of course, if you are new to the show, there are lots of ways to listen. You can, of course, follow the show through RSS feed on my website and email blast. I'm also on YouTube, and that's youtube.com/1138Porkins. And, of course, you can also subscribe on iTunes, TuneIn, and Stitcher. And on Friday nights from 10 to 12, I'm replayed on Awake, PSN, PIR, Ed Opperman's Spreaker channel as well. So if you listen to Ed's show, you'll hear me. And on Saturdays from 6 to 8 Mountain Time, I'm on KYAH 540 AM. So lots of ways to listen to the show. I have some updates and things like that, but maybe you'll save that for later on, sometime in the second hour, about some shows and some little projects and stuff. And I want to thank two people for signing up to Patreon recently. So thank you, Will, and thank you, Conscious Algorithm. And thank you, Conscious Algorithm, because I know we follow each other on Twitter. So thank you so much. And again, if you want to support my work, you can go to patreon.com/Pierce Redmond. And for as little as $1 a month, you can support basically everything that I do, this show and the CIA in Hollywood and all the little projects that I'm working on. So thank you all so much who have been signing up and supporting me. And I've got some Patreon stuff that we can get to a little bit later on. But, excuse me, I want to welcome back our very good friend and frequent guest, Stephen Singlar, of course, an amazing author and a journalist. Stephen's been on the show many times before to discuss OJ and John Bonet and the media. And I'm very pleased to have Stephen on to discuss his brand new book, which is also his first novel. The name of the novel is In the Cards, and we're going to go, in depth on the book. But Stephen, first and foremost, how are you? It's good to talk to you.
Good to be here, Pierce. I'm fine, doing well. How
Excellent.
Are you doing? Sounds like you've got a lot of good things going.
Yeah,
Yep.
but I was just complaining to Danny before we went on air, just work and everything, always kind of, just this week, and I just keep telling myself I just got to get through this week, but I always enjoy being on the radio, and I always enjoy talking to you, so hopefully that'll lift my spirits.
Good.
And as I said, Stephen, this is your first novel, and I'll just say right off the bat, people would have no idea you've never written a novel before because it is such a fantastic read. I was telling you the other day, I read this in just about 2 days. It's just, it's exciting. It's well written. My heart was racing during parts of the book. It really is fantastic. And the novel deals with the 2000 election, and it talks about one journalist's pursuit to expose the truth about how the election was stolen for the GOP and the ripple effects that the 2000 election have had in all subsequent elections. And it brings us up to current time. And it is in some ways it's an explanation of the environment that we see ourselves in right now, and also some of the strange stuff that went on in the 2016 election. But Stephen, why don't you give us the sort of the thumbnail sketch of the book? Because I'm just, I want to hear it from you.
Right. Well, the book is kind of a combination of fact and fiction. I mean, it is a novel because many parts of it are fictionalized, but some of it is based on investigative journalism that was actually done, and it sort of morphed over a long period of time into the piece of fiction that it is today. But it essentially is about a journalist who was just doing some ghostwriting at the end of 2000, actually. If you're somebody like myself, you do all kinds of things to supplement an income or do things between the books that you write that you're actually passionate about. And I've done a lot of ghostwriting for people, and this is about a journalist who's actually writing something for an oil man, and he just very inadvertently stumbles into the 2000 election that was in Florida in 2000, as most people know. The election was on November 7th of that year, and within a few days, the entire system, the election system, had gone haywire down there. And while it was heavily covered, like many other events in American history recently, and while it was very heavily covered at that time, you never got any sort of explanation for what actually happened. Because what did happen, what we know happened, is that the networks, which rely very heavily on polls and have relied heavily on polls for a long time, came out about 10 to 11 on November 7th of that election year and said that Al Gore had won the presidency because he'd won Florida, because he'd won the 25 electoral votes down there, and he would be the new president of the United States. A significant thing, if you stop and think about it, because Bill Clinton had been president for 8 years, and you would have had another democratically elected president of the Democratic Party who was at that time and still is one of the most conscious environmental people in politics, and that would have obviously been an important thing to him. About an hour after the networks, ABC in particular, announced that based upon all the polls, Al Gore was the new president, Peter Jennings, who was the anchor for ABC, came back on and said, excuse me, I'm sorry, but he may not be the president of the United States. So many people are aware that this was very chaotic, a very chaotic time, and it went on and on for about a month after that, and finally it was kicked up from the state court to the federal, or to the Supreme Court, and by a vote of 5-4, George W. Bush was essentially appointed the new president of the United States, and then all of that history followed. But what I was focused on here in writing this is that, again, like in many other cases, criminal cases, other cases, you never got an explanation for why the polls didn't work. They had worked in the past. They were very reliable. And in this particular case, something happened. There was anecdotal information, for example, that people in precincts were watching the votes being counted, and they had to be recounted. This is using paper cards. We don't have as much of this anymore, but these were these infamous paper punch cards. And as they went machines again and again, the changed. That's not what's supposed to happen, but it is what happened in that particular case. So the premise of the story is a journalist who stumbles into investigating what really happened down there, because he's engaged by somebody who's an engineer and who understands something about how cards are made and the manufacturing process and the machines that count them and all of that. If you go back to that time, as is usually the case, the people on television interpreting all this are politicians or lawyers. And they're all advocates for one point of view or another, for their side. So you got a lot of that, a lot of politicking and lawyering, but you didn't get much science around what might have occurred here. If there was any science, it was focused on these machines that count the cards. They're called votomatic machines. But nobody looked at the cards. Nobody was looking at the cards themselves as the potential source of the problem. So in the story, the journalist is engaged by an engineer who says, I think I know what happened here, and it's never come out, and you need to look into this. And so the journalist, goes down there, is able to actually get some of the cards, not the cards that were used in the actual voting, but cards from the same batch that would have been used. They were unused cards, so they were made in the same way, came from the same place, etc. and begins an investigation into the whole card-making process, how they were manufactured, where they came from, what the political connections were around that, and begins to uncover that the manufacturing, the making of these things can be manipulated down to actually 1/5,000th of an inch. You have to pause and think about that for a minute. That, in other words, what was at issue in that election was the behavior of the little pieces of paper called chads. Everyone remembers the famous hanging chad situation. And that's where the investigation is centered on. And so the reporter goes in search of where they were made, how they were made, can they be manipulated, to what degree could they be manipulated, could you make one chad perform one way and one another, and begins to make progress in this regard. If you think back to the election, for those who are old enough to follow it and really remember it, the two issues were what are called overvotes and undervotes. An overvote was where it appeared that a voter had voted for more than one candidate. An undervote was where it appeared that a voter had voted for no candidate. So as the cards went through the machines over and over again, you got both overvotes and undervotes, and it completely skewed the voting. And it's why the networks all had to stop about 11 o'clock on election night and say, we do not know what happened here. We don't know who won. We don't know what's going on. We don't understand any of it. So it's the story of a journalist who really does go behind the scenes and looks at the one place that other people aren't looking, and that's in the cards. That's the name of the book, and begins to figure out that these things can be manipulated. So that's sort of a long overview.
No, excellent. And again, if people want to get a copy of In the Cards, you can go to StephenSinglar.com, and just right there on the front homepage is a link to Amazon, where you can get the book. It is only available as a Kindle, though, right, Stephen?
That's correct. At this point, that's how it's available. I'm working on that.
Oh, excellent, excellent. I would love to get a physical copy at some point, but it's very affordable. It's only $4.99 on Amazon Kindle. So I encourage people to get it, especially too, because we're not going to give away, any of the big kind of spoilers, because again, there's quite a lot of excitement and twists and turns in the novel In the Cards. But we are going to be talking about it, so you might want to pick up a copy of it soon. But Stephen, I wanted to talk first a little bit about Jimmy Iverson, who is the hero of the novel. He is this journalist. He's a freelance journalist who is ghostwriting for Bart Simmons, and we're going to talk a little bit about Bart in just a moment. But Stephen, tell us kind of who is Jimmy as a person and as a journalist? And I mean, maybe it's because I know you pretty well, but I, of course, saw elements of Stephen Singlar in Jimmy Iverson, and I'm sure any novelist is always going to incorporate a little bit of themselves into the character. But tell us a little bit, who is Jimmy Iverson, and and his sort of principles as a journalist, because we meet him sort of at a crossroads in his life, where he's, ghostwriting for this guy Bart, who he can't stand, and he kind of, Bart represents many of the things that Jimmy is opposed to or finds reprehensible. He's also dealing with one of his children. His son is ill and is, lots of mounting medical bills, and there's a lot of pressure on Jimmy. So describe to the listeners a little bit, who is Jimmy Iverson? Well,
yes, that's a good description. Jimmy is like many journalists that I have encountered. He harbors secret ambitions to actually do something important in the world of journalism. And anybody, maybe between the ages of 50 and 80 sort of grew up in the shadow of Watergate. You watch the Watergate scandal unfold. You watch this incredibly significant role played by journalists and a newspaper in the Washington Post. And you saw how the real legwork and real hard, nitty-gritty journalistic work eventually brought down a corrupt president of the United States. And it was a very important event, and it was a very important journalistic event. So Jimmy's sort of going through life. He's trying to make ends meet. You know, he's written a couple of books. They haven't really gotten that far, so he does ghostwriting for, you know, famous people, rich people, which he doesn't like at all, but he needs the money. His son has a medical condition, a problem with his legs. He has a young daughter. His wife can't work right now, and there's a lot of pressure on him to make money. So while sort of cursing his fate at having to do the ghostwriting, he actually stumbles into the biggest journalistic situation of his career, because it appears that the oil man may have some kind of knowledge of what went on in the election, although it's vague. He keeps saying things didn't turn out the way they were supposed to in this situation. And Jimmy gradually, the combination of hearing what the oil man says, especially says when he's heavily drinking, and saying things Jimmy wouldn't otherwise say, and Jimmy hooking up with this engineer who's telling him, I think I have an idea what went on here, the lights sort of start to go on in Jimmy's head, and he thinks that he may have stumbled onto a journalistic coup. One of the points of the book, which I've probably made on your show before in the context of other things, is that if you go back to Watergate, I mean, the thing that is a little bit overlooked there, I've always felt, is people know about Woodward and Bernstein, and they talk about their great work, but it was the support of the Washington Post that made Watergate happen. I mean, they needed financial support, they needed editorial support, they needed, you know, legal support to people who would stand up to them when the Nixon administration started threatening and making threats and all of that. Jimmy's on his own. Jimmy is like a lot of other people 20, 30 years after Watergate who aren't in those institutions. And one of the points of the book is that those institutions for a long time really haven't done that kind of work. So what Jimmy does is, after gathering quite a bit of information about the election system, getting the cards, testing the cards a little bit, thinking he's really onto this, he contacts one of the most prominent journalistic outfits in the United States, who is not named in the book, but he is convinced that if he points them in the right direction and gives them the right information, they will do a similar thing with this situation as the Washington Post did in the Watergate era, because the clear implication here is that this was not a legitimate election, that the American public needs to know what happened and how it was done, and they have to sort of fix the election system going forward, because it's going to be vulnerable again to other influences. So he goes to the most prominent network situation in the United States, and a lot of the drama in the book focuses around his relationship with a producer there who becomes interested in the story, but kind of does a push-pull dance with him, where we're going to do it, we're not going to do it, we'll investigate this up to a certain point, and then we'll stop. And in the real-time context of the story, this is the end of 2000 and the beginning of 2001. As most of us know, 2001 was a benchmark year in the history of the United States for reasons that we can get into. But the point I'm trying to make through the telling of the story is that it's an entirely different situation when a freelance journalist or an independent journalist takes on something without that kind of institutional support, and when you have that kind of institutional support. And I think that's an underlying change in journalism in the United States, you know, in the last 30 or 40 years we've talked about in other situations. I mean, you had great journalism in the 1960s with the war in Vietnam and civil rights and all that. You had outstanding journalism, institutional journalism in the 70s with Watergate. It went on into the 80s with Iran-Contra and all of those situations, and then it began to change. And that's one of the points of the book.
Oh, absolutely. And you illustrate that so well, Stephen, in the writing and in the book itself. I mean, when you see, Jimmy reaches out to this producer at this large network, Jane, who he has an extremely complex relationship with, and they used to date for many years. And it is a wonderful sort of look into, as you were saying, how TV journalism in particular has kind of become the de facto way through which news is consumed. And of course, in Jimmy's mind, this will be okay. They have all these resources and stuff. And you see, particularly in 2000 into 2001, you just mentioned a benchmark year. I mean, 9/11 and the Iraq War factor heavily towards the later part of this book, the last third of the book. Those events have begun to unfold, and you see that, the news is all, patriotism, and we got to go after the terrorists and Iraq and WMDs, and that becomes sort of the focus. And you see how these large outlets, be they TV or newspapers or radio, whatever, the way, they're willing to cover the story, but only on their terms. You see that, for a freelance journalist like Jimmy, I mean, he's essentially told, thanks for the story. We're interested. We're going to take it. And you have no control over it from this
right.
point on. They tell Jimmy, don't do your own research. Don't talk to anyone. Never speak about this. You can never take credit for this. I mean, it's funny because, while Jimmy is ghostwriting this book for Bart Simmons, a book he will have no credit for, more or less. I mean, he's going to get a paycheck at least. And this is the same thing. He's sort of ghostwriting this amazing story for a news outlet, and he'll really get no sort of credit for this. Quickly, Stephen, just because the whole issue of ghostwriting is fascinating to me, and I assume you have done some ghostwriting in the past. Again, I'm just on StephenSinglar.com. I mean, you've written books with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, with Terrell Owens, so I assume you have some sort of an idea about this. But explain, I mean, what is it like ghostwriting with someone, particularly someone like a Bart Simmons, who I want to get into in a minute. But, I mean, he is this powerful, larger-than-life executive. I mean, what is it like, sitting down and listening, and how do you actually go about, writing, an autobiography for someone? Well,
in a situation like that, which is something I was somewhat involved in, but not precisely that situation, it's all public relations, essentially. In other words, people like him are surrounded by PR people within a corporation. They feed you a lot of information. They give you a lot of documents. The purpose of it is to say that Bart took over this company. It was worth $2 billion under his leadership. Now we're at $16 billion and growing every year by 8%. And this is how we did it. And this, so it's not a real, true journalistic situation in most cases. I mean, you're there as a sort of, to support the man and the corporation. And for any real journalist, I mean, that's part of the story here. That's a tough thing to do. That's grading. I mean, on the other hand, it can pay you very well. And that's Jimmy's conflict, because he doesn't want to be there. He wants to do something important. And he's naive, and his naivety is also part of the story. And he thinks if he can get to the network, they will surely see the value in this and pick it up and run with it. And his real point with them, and I think, and this is the real sort of overriding point of the story, is if we don't fix this thing now, if we don't find out what happened in a journalistic sense, even a historic sense, we're going to be vulnerable going forward. And they just sort of blow him off. Oh, this will never happen again. This could never happen. Once in a lifetime. You're wrong about that. And that's one of the mantras of the book. And he's saying, no, I mean, if X could manipulate this system, well, the other side could manipulate it. And then he has the craziest thought of all. What if a foreign country was able to manipulate our election system? And they say, no, that could never happen. That's absolutely impossible. So one of the things that also happened back there and this is a real thing, is that because the punch cards didn't work the way they were supposed to, the companies that were bringing in the new form of election voting, which was electronic voting, jumped in and said, let us sell you all of our equipment, right? So that's hundreds of millions of dollars spent to replace the cards with what most of us now understand is probably a more vulnerable system. The hacking that can go on with that. Anyway, those are some of the major points of the story. I mean, but ghostwriting itself, I mean, it's a fairly easy way to make money because it's not strenuous to the degree that, some real journalism can be. It's not, risky in the way that some real journalism can be. You're not always stepping on somebody's toes and pissing them off the way real journalism can be. You're working, in a capacity for somebody else. And from a real, true journalistic point of view, it's an easier thing to do. Some of the personalities you encounter doing it are not, everything you want them to be. But that sort of goes along with the job.
Right.
Let me put that a slightly different way. If you can make $20 million a year playing a sport, $100,000 to write a book is peanuts, and you don't necessarily want to devote a lot of time to it.
Okay, right.
You can extrapolate from there.
Yes, that's
most ghostwriters end up doing the great bulk of the work, and stay in the background.
Yeah, so. Right. We have to name names. I'm sure some of the people you work for barely, contribute, even though your name is
the most famous example of that, just as an aside, is that Charles Barkley, the NBA star, had somebody wrote his book, and he was being interviewed about it, and they said, "What about this thing you're talking about in chapter 6?" And he said, "I don't know. I never read the books." There are many stories. There are many stories in that ilk, and that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Quickly, I wanted to just talk a little bit about Bart Simmons, because he, again, Stephen, tremendous character that you've written here, and he really is this. He's so fleshed out. I mean, I felt like I really was like meeting this person, and it was so funny. I fully admit that while I was reading, I was repulsed by Bart most of the time, but there were these moments where I found myself like in awe of this person, and what he's accomplished. And again, this is, to your credit for, in your skill as a writer, but I sort of also began to kind of get Bart's worldview and understand where he's coming from, and especially when he's like talking about the power of oil and the dependence we have on oil. And there's a wonderful scene where he's had, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 glasses of bourbon, and each time he asks Jimmy to fix him a drink, he keeps telling him less ice this time, and making a double or a triple. Right. And Bart begins sort of going off on this rant about, how did you get here? You drove a car to the airport, and then the airport, you took you flew on the plane, and again when you were in the airport, the lights were all on, and there's lights on in your house, and he says this is all oil. Everybody, whether they like it or not, needs oil. And there's a part where Bart says, that there's this huge burden on him, on the oil man in general, but on him in particular. And that people want these things. They want the creature comforts of life, but they don't like the consequences, and they don't like what has to be done. And Bart truly does believe that what he's doing is for the good of the American people and ultimately of the world. And and I wanted to throw this to you, Stephen, and maybe I read this the wrong way, but I didn't even really see Bart as a true villain. And for me, there were no true, clear-cut, tropes of villains. There was no, cliche villain in the book. It was a lot of people that were sort of doing what they believed was the right thing, which I think is probably more true to life. But talk just a little bit about Bart, and his sort of, his character and his worldview, and And again, I mean, because like I said, there were times where I was sort of like, you know, he kind of has a point, you know, or I understood where he was coming from, and there's something sort of admirable. I mean, he did kind of come from nothing and was able to, you know, build this empire. So talk a little bit about Bart.
Well, I think, first of all, when you're writing a novel, from my point of view, I don't find life to be black and white, and I don't want to reflect that in the writing, you know, either nonfiction or fiction. I really appreciate what you just said, because a lot of work went into trying to make him a complex and more complete character. You know, it would be very easy just to make him a cliche and a really bad person. But I mean, most of my fascination with writing comes from seeing people as part of, you know, larger organisms, larger, you know, of a society, of a community, and of those things. And you're right, absolutely right. He thinks he's providing a very critical and good service to the world, and he has done some good things. So I'm really glad that you picked up on that, because I wasn't trying to make him, you know, all bad or all good. He's reflective of a society like ours, which demands, you know, unbelievable amounts of oil every day, and until we sort of get past that, that's where we are, and we are all a part of that. You know, Jane is the same way, who works at the network. I mean, she's trying to kind of work with Jimmy, but she has to protect her position there, and she can't go too far. You know, Jimmy's independent. He wants the world to work faster and to work, you know, more smoothly, and it just doesn't. But anyway, I think I mean, there are ironies in the book that we haven't gotten to, but the fact that Bart, one of the key things that Bart always says is, you know, once the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of the 80s and early 90s, we have to be the dominant power. We have to keep our foot on their neck. We have to control the narrative, and we can never let them get back to where they are. And that's, again, an underlying theme of the whole book, because that is sort of the way the United States has viewed the world since then. And that will come into play, obviously, as the story moves into the present and the situation that we're in now. But Bart is sort of speaking for all those things. You know, this is the American century. This is American power. And oil's the underlying part of that, and we have to protect all that. And even Jimmy, you know, who doesn't, you know, finds many things about the guy repugnant, can't totally, you know, argue with everything he's saying. So I've tried to, you know, with fiction, you can take certain liberties. You can make a character like that more fleshed out and more complicated, and that's what I've tried to do. And again, to show, you know, Jimmy being the main character, I mean, he is caught in all these social, you know, economic realities just like everybody else. And he has, you know, he compromises to, you know, to take care of his family. So the whole thing is meant to be, you know, more complicated than you're going to get on a soundbite, you know. So,
oh yeah, absolutely.
You know, I mean, that's really the part of it, is that, you know, there's this great today examination of the minutia of everything that happened during one day in the White House or something, but as a writer, you want to get beyond that, to the larger forces at work.
Oh, and certainly Bart is a very big picture sort of an individual. There's a couple of sequences. I mean, you're just talking about when Bart is talking about the sort of collapse of the Soviet Union, and maybe we can get into some of that as well, because Bart, you know, is part of a group of businessmen, you know, American and Western European, that went to Russia in the 90s and, you know, hung out with lots of oligarchs and things like that. And we hear Bart talking about the need to control oil and gas in Central Asia. You know, he's always talking about Turkmenistan. He talks about Afghanistan as a potential. And again, you have to kind of put yourself back in, you know, in the book, we're talking about 2000. I mean, most people would have never thought of Afghanistan, let alone Turkmenistan or Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. I mean, any of these Central Asian countries. Yet Bart is seeing into the future in some respects, and is very prescient in what he's telling Jimmy about the necessity for all of these things. So yeah, I really did enjoy Bart as a character, and there are some really wonderful moments where Bart is talking about his father, and we, again, we are able to see that behind the facade of this hard drinking, adulterous, kind of racist or very politically incorrect individual. Yeah. There is he is a human being. He misses his father. He's always talking about, his father would have never approved of a lot of his behavior. And we see that has a tremendous effect on Bart. And Jimmy, again, as a great journalist and listener, is able to get Bart to talk about these things in a way that, Bart tells him, I've never talked like this with anybody, let alone, some, weasel from the media, and of course Bart has been burned previously by another ghostwriter who, didn't really follow his, non-disclosure agreement, properly. So yeah, just a wonderful, I think people will really get a kick out of Bart as a character. Bart is in some ways, along with Tony, who is Jimmy's engineer friend, who first kind of tells him, I think there's something with these cards. Bart is also one of the people that provides a lot of this information. He's dropping hints. And he keeps saying that it wasn't supposed to be like this. This was supposed to be an easy election. We were supposed to get this. This eventually leads Jimmy to going to Arkansas, of all places, where he visits Burning House Systems, which is a company that produces the punch cards, and then of course later on in the book they're the ones that don't worry, we know the punch cards were wrong, but trust our voting machines, and let's install those all over the place. This is another interesting factor here, because Jimmy is one of the main problems that Jimmy has is that, if the GOP was able to do this, then what's going to stop the Democrats from doing this? What's going to stop the GOP from doing it again? What's going to stop a foreign government, or even, say, a person like Bart? If you get enough rich guys together, and Burning House as this company is, they seem to really have no allegiance to anybody but themselves. Just talk a little bit about that briefly. Just the fact that we have these companies that are providing us with these things that are supposed to be, about democracy, and we all get a vote and all of our votes matter. And we see quite explicitly how corrupt this is as a system. And it's not just, Burning House is the one that we focus on in the book, obviously, but there are lots of other companies out there, some of which, people will be familiar with, some they may not be. And there's very little oversight about what goes on. And again, there's a part where, later on, we see the same thing happen in the 2004 election. And Jimmy remarks, this is the same thing. And then again after that. And ultimately the book ends in current times. So, I don't know, Stephen, do you think we've kind of like given too much power to these, again, it's like the sort of like corporatization of America. Now, we have these private companies, which all of course have ties to various politicians that are in charge of, who gets to be elected president, and what does that say about us? Right.
I think you're hitting, on all the right points there. Jimmy goes to the plant in Arkansas. He's walking around the plant. He's being guided through it by this manager, and he realizes, or the manager tells him that, that the making of these cards can actually be manipulated down to 1/5000th of an inch. And by simply, adjusting the blades that are made to make the little cuts in the paper and all of that. And as he's, walking through there, the light sort of goes on in his head, and he realizes, well, you can make these cards do anything you want them to. And I don't think anybody had really conceived of that maybe before, although there was anecdotal information at that time in the real world that the United States had done some of this in third world countries, that some of this had actually gone on to elect the people that they wanted elected. I mean, we know that, there have been manipulations and machinations around propping up people or getting people elected. But I'd never heard anything regarding, this element of the election system until I started to look into this. And so it wasn't probably the first time that it had ever happened. And it was just a matter of, sort of connecting the dots of where they were made, where they were sent, who used them. All of the election data, for example, if you looked at Miami-Dade County back then or now, the minority people there voted 10-1 for Democrats. All of that information was absolutely known before the cards were ever made. So you start to realize the potential here for manipulation. And in one, I know, like the one example that I had is that there were, I alluded earlier to undervotes, which means that the voter apparently didn't vote for anybody. In Broward County back then, for example, there were 6,600 undervotes. That's a very heavily Democratic area. Well, George Bush ended up winning the election, winning in quotes, by 247 votes. So you can do the math. There were tens of thousands of these cards that were thrown out in that election because of malfunction. So anyway, the vulnerability was absolutely there. Once Jimmy goes and looks into this, he figures out, how the cards are used in a given state. Then he goes and figures out how they're manufactured. Then he goes and figures out that process can be manipulated. Then in the course of the novel, someone who worked in the factory, someone who was actually on the assembly line, learns about him and his investigation and comes to him and pleads with him to do something about this because he understands what went on. He has a first-hand knowledge of what actually occurred in this particular situation. Jimmy tries, again, he goes back to the network and he says, you have to work with this person. You have to put them on camera. You have to get them to explain what went on. And the network balks. The network comes right up to the edge of saying, we're going to do something about this. We're going to get to the bottom of it. And it doesn't happen. And that's sort of the arc of this whole story. You didn't learn the truth back then. Then you changed the election system into, computerized voting. And then if you go to 2004 and you look at it in real terms, again, history sort of repeats itself. John Kerry is ahead in the critical state in that election, which is not Florida this time, but Ohio. And at 11 o'clock at night, the system goes down. He's leading. The system comes back up. He's behind. And again, it looks by all accounts that you have an illegitimate election in the United States. So, I mean, these are the themes I was trying to get at, because nothing ever came out in a real sense back in 2000. What has been the residue of that going forward through our history? And I think we see where we are today and how many questions are swirling around that. So I had done some writing on this in a nonfiction sense and kind of put it aside. And then when we had the 2016 election, I thought, I've got to write this out now in a more complete way. And that's why I wrote the book In the Cards.
No, excellent. And just quickly, I'll just throw it as a personal story. I once worked as an election worker for a midterm election. I can't remember. I think it was 2010. And it was the first time that they had implemented the electronic voting machines here in New York State. Prior to that, we used the lever system. We were still doing that in New York even into 2010. And this midterm election, we were using these voting machines, and I can, swear on a stack of Bibles, they all broke that night. And none of them worked. And suddenly, the guy who was our head person, he said, he attempted to lock the doors, and he said, no one is leaving until we count all of the votes, by hand. And there were tens of thousands. You know, we were in out in Bay Ridge in New York. I mean, there were thousands upon thousands of people that were voting. And, you know, full disclosure, I grabbed my backpack and ran out the door because I had spent, you know, it's like the longest day of your life. You get there at like 4:35 in the morning, and then you sit in this big auditorium, and then they ship you out. And I was just like, there's no way I'm staying here to count all these votes. But, you know, it was in a lot of ways, it was like a peek behind the curtain. You saw they had no idea what they were doing. We had no idea what happened to the voting machines. They're trying to call IT people. They don't know why they're wrong. I mean, there was a real fear that we had lost all of the data that day that was, you know, on these voting machines. And, you know, and election workers, they're just regular people. They don't know what they're doing. You know, I mean, all of the people around me were just sort of like, you know, everyone is just sort of doing it because because it's a paycheck, and B, you know, you have this sort of civic, oh, this is a good thing and whatever. But you can see how easily something like this could happen. I mean, and this is, I don't think there was something nefarious behind this, but who knows what could have happened? Right. You know, just a simple malfunction, and suddenly there's no voting for all of Bay Ridge, you know, for a whole congressional district is just missing. Now, that was maybe a mistake or an accident, but you can see how, you know, God forbid what could happen if somebody really wanted to do something. And it's interesting there, Stephen, you were talking about how the media never really, you know, dug into this. They never really kind of picked up on this. Again, people at the time were talking about maybe it was the car, you know, it wasn't the cards. Maybe it was the machines. Maybe it was the hanging chads. You know, we heard, the voters were stupid again, the sort of veiled races, you know, of course, all the counties with, you know, large, Black and Hispanic populations, they didn't know how to vote properly, even though they've all been, you know, they've been voting for years before that, no problem. You know, so you get all of that. And it's interesting, you know, Jane's outlet, they seem fascinated by the story at first, and it's obviously it could be a big scoop. And then, like you said, they go to the water's edge and they say whatever. And it's not even like it's not like part of this whole conspiracy. We find out that basically the network is like, listen, we want to buy up a bunch of other channels and outlets, and they have all these business deals, and they don't want to upset the incoming administration. You know, it can be as simple as that, and suddenly the story is dropped, and nobody will listen to Jimmy. And we see, you know, multiple outlets and stuff telling him, oh, well, it doesn't matter. You know, who cares? And you can see how something like that, you know, this sort of indifference. And then, of course, later on, we get 9/11. You know, and suddenly, you know, Jimmy says nobody cares. You know, he said, you know, all of these people were like, listen, the second those towers went down, the whole agenda changed. It's all about patriotism.
The moment is past.
Exactly. And the moment is past. Yeah, that's what he keeps being told, you know, and or they tell him, oh, the story is stale. And it's, of course, I mean, one of the ironies there is the coverage becomes about an event like 9/11, which I would argue we still don't fully understand or, you know, really have a grasp on what actually transpired. But, you know, all of the coverage basically just becomes PR and propaganda for a war that Bart, of course, was talking about at least a year before it even happened. Like it was an inevitability that, you know, Afghanistan and the Russians and Central Asia. And suddenly that becomes the focus. It's not even about journalism. It's just Jane is like, listen, I've got to keep producing these pro-American pieces and, you know, nobody cares. You know, the election is over. The Supreme Court made their decision. And it's funny, Stephen, I mean, I'd like to get your comment on this. I mean, you know, then we basically just, you know, once that happened, that was it. And every time since then, whenever there's been, and there are voting irregularities in every single election since 2000, from you know, on the national presidential stage all the way down to like your local, you know, sheriff or, you know, county judge, there are always election problems. And it's just nobody really bats an eye at it. And I don't know, talk about that, Stephen, just that, I mean, again, nobody really questions it, or it's sort of like, oh, okay, whatever.
Well,
you know, even
I think, again, I mean, if you sort of, you know, look at the big picture, I'm just fascinated by history, you know, by what we call history, whatever, you know, that actually turns out to be. But there was this moment, you know, in early 2001 where there was a chance to actually, you know, find out what happened and maybe do something about it. I mean, this is not exactly on topic, but I'm fascinated by the FBI and others knowing in the summer of 2016 that all this stuff was going on with the Russians. I mean, it's kind of the same story. Why didn't you tell us? I mean, what is the obligation of public institutions to inform the public? And, you know, after the election, we learn all this stuff, but they had the dossier on Trump. They had all kinds of stuff. And it's like, well, we don't, you know, again, but think about what really happened at that point. First, the Obama administration doesn't want to look partisan, but beyond that, all the polls said, that's what really motivated me to write this book, is that all the polls said Trump can't win, Hillary can't lose. The polls will be right. The polls were wrong. The polls were dead wrong again for some reason, and that's what we need to understand. So there was that moment back then where you have sort of one journalist with his hair on fire calling not just that network, because he does reach out to a lot of other major journalistic organizations, and they all say that they shrug and they all say the same thing. The story's dead. You know, leave us alone. And that, you know, that kind of stuff really fascinates me because history just moves on and you don't take advantage of those moments. And I think what's happened more recently is that, and I would go so far as to say that for a long time, major parts of the mainstream media were completely asleep at the wheel. And so what we have now is that there's actually an awakening, I think. I think they're upset enough and they feel that they've been duped enough that they're starting to do their job again. And that's another sort of underlying theme of the whole story, is that when you go to sleep, when you don't get to the bottom of these things, when you don't do the investigation, there are consequences. And then finally the consequences get big enough and ugly enough and bad enough, and everybody wakes up and says, well, how did that happen? Well, that's how it happened. It happened because our election system is totally vulnerable. And there were numerous people, I mean, not just me, but or the characters in the book or others who were looking into all this stuff back then and writing books about it and articles, and nobody was paying attention. They said, well, that'll never happen again. Well, it happened in 2004, which extended the Bush administration by 4 years and all of that. And then when the Obama elections were seemingly more legitimate, although something did happen in 2012, but he was so far ahead that it didn't matter. And then we get to 2016. So, you know, as a writer, as a journalist, as an investigator, as a novelist, I mean, you want to get to the bigger themes, the bigger issues, and not just the minutia. And to me, this was a real vehicle for doing that.
No, absolutely. And again, talking about the minutia, I mean, again, I'm sure today you can turn on any of the three-letter news outlets, and they're going to be talking about, I mean, even when they're big topics, you know, like, say, Mike Pompeo becoming Secretary of State, they will get into the most, like you said, this minutia, this silliness of not even the 24-hour news cycle, but it's like a, 24-minute, 24-second news cycle, and they're on to the next thing. And yet the larger issues behind all of this are never really discussed. I mean, In the Cards is a perfect example of this, where, Jimmy at times is, there are times where he's just sort of yelling to a wall. Nobody really wants to take him seriously.
Right.
Even though, again, this is like a huge story. This is like an instant Pulitzer. This is,
right.
Conceivably they could have sent people to jail over this.
Right.
This type of scrutiny. Well,
right.
We are at the break right now, and hopefully we will be continuing the conversation. Stay tuned.
the world's meeting place. American.
Practically narcotic.
Freedom.
Oh, yes, I like very much.
Radio.
You're an American institution.
American Freedom Radio.
Simply Clean Foods is dedicated to providing the best quality food you can buy next to fresh from a farmer's market. Our stringent quality controls and absolute zero GMOs plus testing for heavy metals makes us unique in the storable foods market. Our line of fruits, vegetables, and meats are suitable for everyday use, and you won't have to worry about throwing away valuable groceries ever again. Take out the amount you need and reseal the package for use within the next 6 months. Simply Clean Foods' primary focus is to bring clean food to people all around the world and change the way we look at freeze-dried food in our daily cooking. Go to simplycleanfoods.net. That's www.simplycleanfoods.net today.
This is Rick Simpson, and you're listening to American Freedom Radio.
American Survival Wholesale is a proud sponsor of the American Freedom Radio. And when you purchase quality products from AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com, you help support this program. Our quality non-GMO foods do not contain MSG, high fructose corn syrup, or heavy metals. At American Survival Wholesale, you can choose from over 8,000 quality products, including self-defense weapons, bug-out bags, and long-term storable food at wholesale prices. We also have custom food packs available, including gluten-free, dairy-free, and vegetarian packs. If we don't have it, you don't need it. American Survival Wholesale is a veteran-owned and operated company which also supports our veterans in need, and we are very active in disaster relief. If you would like to become a distributor, please email us at bugoutamerica@usa.com or call 818-720-0759. We offer free consultations to answer all your questions. Do it today while things are calm. That's AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com.
I don't like words that hide the truth. I don't like words that conceal reality. I don't like euphemisms. And American English is loaded with euphemisms because Americans have a lot of trouble dealing with reality. Americans have trouble facing the truth. So they invent a kind of a soft language to protect themselves from it. I'll give you an example of that. When I was a little kid, if I got sick, they wanted me to go to the hospital and see the doctor. Now they want me to go to a health maintenance organization. Smug, greedy, well-fed white people have invented a language to conceal their sins. It's as simple as that. The CIA doesn't kill anybody anymore. They neutralize people. The government doesn't lie. It engages in disinformation. Israeli murderers are called commandos. Arab commandos are called terrorists. Contra killers are called freedom fighters. Well, if crime fighters fight crime and firefighters fight fire, what do freedom fighters fight? They never mention that part of it to us, do they? Never mention that part of it.
You're listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, the network who perseveres in delivering intelligent debate, constructive dialogue with true independence. The freedom to broadcast the truth is not free at all. So what is American Freedom Radio worth to you? The empowering information with fun, honest and pure integrity behind it provides an example to follow. Friendships to flourish with the moral altruism that pulls no punches. The hosts sacrifice and show remarkable discipline in their duty to deliver quality radio in service to the community with strength, wisdom, and loyalty. The founders of AFR wish to thank you personally for sharing your views and insights to make the best radio and alternative media. Now it's time for you to give something back and play a vital role in the future of America. Be as generous with us as we've been with you. Click on the donate banner at AmericanFreedomRadio.com. or volunteer by emailing AmericanFreedomRadio.com. Vaccine, psychotropic drugs, and artillery batteries not included.
Launch sequence initiated.
We're now in the approach phase. Everything looking good. Control the all out. Control is good. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Prepare your mind to experience American Freedom Radio. Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything: geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you you live from New York City. Your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to Porkins Policy Radio. I am Pierce Redmond. If you are just joining us now in the second hour, we have been speaking with our very good friend, a frequent guest, Stephen Singlar. Of course, the investigative journalist behind such amazing books as Legacy of Deception, Presumed Guilty, Talk to Death, many, many other books, including, as we were talking about in the first hour, a book with that he wrote with Terrell Owens. And we have been speaking with Stephen all about his brand new book, his very first novel, In the Cards, which you can find on Amazon Kindle for the low, low price of $4.99. So there's really no excuse out there for not buying the book and supporting Stephen. Stephen, I had a few other things that I really wanted to kind of explore with you in terms of In the Cards, what you bring up there, and of course real life, what's going on right now. And towards the end of the first hour there, we were speaking about the lack of media scrutiny that the 2000 election had. How big, particularly these big media outlets like the cable news and newspapers and things, how they sort of like drop the ball and all that. And I want to kind of continue that a little bit, but I also wanted to bring in this other aspect, and one of the kind of like things that really kind of got me and gripped me when I was reading is the impact that this story has on Jimmy as a character. And you see, quite quickly, this election story and the pursuit of exposing the truth about this, it becomes Jimmy's entire life. And in a lot of ways, I think you can look at one of the themes in the Cards is sort of a cautionary tale, that there are serious effects that a story like this can have, and pursuing a story like this. And there are some really disastrous effects, the fallout of this story on Jimmy's own life. And, like I said, I don't want to give away any of the twists and turns and stuff because there's so much in the book. But, I mean, for one thing, Jimmy becomes increasingly obsessive, and later paranoid, there is some validity behind his paranoia. People are going after him, and, there's a very, scary scene where, he's interviewing Bart in New York in his penthouse, and Bart essentially, sort of tells him, you've got to be like one of us, and, I got to make sure you're still with it. And he sort of insinuates that he knows he knows that he's told Jimmy perhaps a little bit too much in some of their conversations. Perhaps Bart is even somewhat aware of Jimmy's, investigation down in Arkansas or other places. And he kind of threatens Jimmy in the sort of jovial way that, Bart Simmons does this. We also see kind of like the self-destructive side of Jimmy. He begins a pretty serious drinking habit. Those scenes were, wonderful just in the way you write them. But, we see Jimmy begins hiding bourbon like all around his house. He's got a special little flask on his bedside, night table next to some mouthwash. And we see Jimmy waking up in the middle of the night constantly taking a swig, then a swig of mouthwash, going to sleep so his wife Tish won't find out. Jimmy's constantly drinking. Like anytime he gets in the car, he's always got a pint of bourbon that he sips on periodically. And I guess the relationship with his loved ones becomes extremely strained, and Jimmy's life begins to deteriorate fairly rapidly. And I think this is like a real threat, that having your life fall apart over a story like this is real. And Stephen, I kind of wanted to just talk a little bit about that because, again, I think that's a serious problem for anyone that's involved in serious journalism. And no doubt, Stephen, yourself, you have been involved in some very high-profile investigations, O.J. Simpson, John Benet Ramsey, the Alan Berg murder. More recently, some of your other books have dealt with some pretty, controversial topics, and certainly some dangerous individuals. And I'm sure you've felt that kind of pressure. But talk a little bit about, the sort of unraveling of Jimmy, because it's quite scary when you see it. I mean, especially Jimmy's drinking, and I'm sure you've met many a journalist who has succumbed to the pleasures of a bourbon bottle. But talk a little bit about that.
Well, the loss of innocence and naivety is a very difficult thing for some people. And if you grow up, believing in certain...
Your audio's a little low. Are you away from the phone?
No. Is that better?
No, it's still a little bit low. I mean, hopefully it'll come through for the listeners.
Hold on. Let me see if I can adjust that. The loss of innocence or naivety that many people walk around with. I mean, you were just sort of doing, I think, what was a George Carlin clip. I'm going to adjust the phone here. Hello? Is that better?
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Is that better?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. So, it's kind of an American trait. I mean, we talk a lot in cliches about, the greatest country in the world and freedom of the press and, the value of the truth and all of that. But when the rubber really meets the road on that, it doesn't always play out that way. And again, it goes back to what I was saying about the institutional support of real investigative journalism is extremely important. It is very, very valuable. It has uncovered many scandals in our own society and brought certain people to justice. I think it has significantly fallen off in the last 25 years, mostly because of economic, reasons, and the technology changes and TV news sort of dominates over everything else, and it's really a soundbite culture. Jimmy believes, in part because of Watergate and all of that if he gets the right story and the right facts to the right people at the right time, they will do the right thing. They will take action. They will see the importance of it for the entire society, for the election system, for democracy, for all of those things. And he runs headlong into the fact that isn't necessarily true, and that the corporate journalism people in the story have a lot of other things that they're thinking about, their careers, the money situation at the network, the whole thing. And he bounces off of that very hard, and then he goes to a lot of other outlets, major newspapers, magazines, etc., and nobody will listen to the story. And then, as you say, is very, correctly, he starts to self-destruct. He doesn't have certain inner resources to fall back on. And he's kind of left in that position of, I'm in possession of a certain truth that I think is very important, and nobody else does, and I don't know what to do with it. And I'm hoping, when people read the book, that they will see it as sort of a literary, example of some of things that actually, that go on. The great literary theme over and over again is always the individual versus society, And here's an individual who's punctured and penetrated something that he thinks is very important, and I think is very important, and nobody will pay attention to it. And the next thing his country is enmeshed in, these endless wars, killing people all over the world, torturing people all over the world, doing all of these things. And the moment is past, and he can't cope with it. I mean, his wife says, give it up, stop. There's no reason to go on. This is a done thing. You've got to accept that and go on. And he has this terrible inner struggle of, I don't want to go on. I have to do this because it's important. And, he just proceeds to deteriorate because the society doesn't want to pay attention to that. Eventually, the society may pay a price for that. But that's the larger arc of the story. Anybody who's tried to do something that is highly unpopular, that they truly believe in. I mean, whether it goes back to the Civil Rights Act, actions back then, a long time ago, or other things, anybody who's taken a stand like that has experienced some of these emotions, and this story just sort of pushes it, a little bit farther. So, I've tried, nobody wants to read a book of ideas. You want to see ideas. I mean, one idea here is that, investigative journalism sort of went to sleep, and there's a price to pay for that. But nobody wants to read ideas. They want to read about people, and they want to read about drama, and they want to read about the emotions that these create in real people when they're caught in this sort of vice of, here's society and here's the lone individual. If Jimmy had been working for the New York Times and the New York Times had believed in everything he was doing and decided to get to the bottom of it, as it's actually doing now in some of the Russia-Trump investigation, it would have been a different story. But that wasn't there. Time and again, people will say, one of the famous lines that came out of all this was some editor saying to him, if that had happened, we'd know about it. That's an incredible thing for somebody in the news business to say. It's like saying, everything is just totally obvious. Well, no, if Bob Woodward doesn't go over and cover the little, legal proceeding for the Watergate break-in, nothing ever happens. Nothing would ever have happened with that. And it would have just fallen into the dustbin of history. So, when you're my age and you live through some of these journalistic wars and you've seen how some in the media react to things, we know the truth, we don't want to know anything else, get out of here. That's not a healthy response to complicated political and social realities.
Oh, totally. That line about if it had happened, we would have known it. It sort of made me think of something you mentioned in the first hour. Iran-Contra. And people that didn't want to believe Robert Perry when he was talking about it, or certainly, everyone that didn't want to believe Gary Webb when he was writing about it in the 90s.
Yeah, and so Gary Webb ends up dead, too. He ends up dead.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a price to pay for being a whistleblower. Most whistleblowers pay some sort of price, and that's the point of this whole story.
Another thing that sort of kind of falls in line with what we were just talking about there is again, there's another sort of, the beginning of the book, Jimmy is very much at a crossroads between, wanting to be able to provide for his family, also wanting to be, more present with his family. He's flying around to New York constantly. He's always in a 5-star hotel that's paid for by Bart. They drink all night. They eat steak dinners. He flies first class. At some point, Bart is like, you can fly on my private jet. And Jimmy's wife, Tish, is at home with 2 kids, one of which is, struggling with, problems with his legs. He can't walk. He's always going, he has to go in for surgery. Tish is always stressed out. She wants Jimmy there. She can't work. And then later on, when this election story really begins to unfold and Jimmy starts, putting together all of these dots and making connections, and he's getting, he gets this guy from the Burning House Factory that wants to talk to him, and, he gets some more information. Jimmy is then again at another crossroads, where, does he pursue the truth and expose all of this, or does he just kind of, drop the story, work for Bart, finish that, come home, work on his relationship with his wife and helping his kids. And this is, again, it's a really tough choice. And as a reader, I even found myself kind of going back and forth. Obviously, you want Jimmy to pursue this. You want Jim, and again, you want to kind of, you want to get to the bottom of this mystery. Who is behind this? What is at stake? Is anyone going to help Jimmy? But there were times where, Tish is talking to him and you really feel for her, and you really are like, while yes, of course, this is a huge story and this is groundbreaking. This is life-changing in so many ways. If Jimmy can prove this, then, this changes everything around the United States and around the world. Again, Burning House, this company in Arkansas, they produce these machines in other countries. They're used all over the world. How many other elections have been rigged? But there is this moment where, Jimmy kind of has to make this decision, and I'm sure you've dealt with similar things. I'm sure you know people that have dealt with similar things. And I guess, Stephen, I wanted to just sort of get your opinion on that. Because it's this dilemma, and you kind of wonder, is it really worth it? And furthermore, how far are you willing to go? Are you willing to destroy the relationship with your wife or your husband, put your kids' lives in danger, put your own life in danger for the pursuit of this? And I don't know. Stephen, what is your take on that? How important is this?
Well, the first thing here is that I feel like a writer that I've conveyed some of the drama and complexity of the story just from the things that you're saying. I don't think life is black and white. I don't see the world in those terms, but, I see it as complex things and complex situations. And when you talk about it, that sort of gets reflected back to me, and I would hope that, other readers would see that in the story. You're not only getting a piece of sort of buried history here, but you're also getting a dramatic story that I hope is told well. So that's all good. In every situation where high stakes are involved, you have to come to grips with the questions that you're talking about. When do you stop? If you're dealing with dangerous people, my first book was about neo-Nazis killing a talk show host here in Denver. The book's called Talk to Death. And I interviewed people who were, close to the group that killed Alan Berg here, the talk show host. And those people made threats. And I had nightmares over it. I had, sort of visions of neo-Nazis kicking in the front door and doing bad things to me. And, at a certain point, you say, okay, I've done enough research. I'm not going to go any further with that. I'm not going to go undercover into a neo-Nazi enclave and try and, get closer to this. These are the questions that come up when you do this kind of work. And in the Simpson case, it was the same thing. There were, I believe, extremely dangerous people who committed those crimes against those two people. And you want to know about it, but you don't want to get too close to it. And so, this situation in the book in the cards, the novel, is fiction. And you kind of take your own experience and you sort of push it a little bit farther than it actually went. You amplify it to make points. That's the real writerly job here. My life is interesting up to a point, but I haven't killed myself over any of these journalistic situations. And so this was an example to sort of, to make the point, the real point that you're making in the book, which is that if the society doesn't pay attention to these things, it's eventually going to be a big problem. And then when people scratch their head and say, how did we get here? This book is really telling you how we got here, how we got to a situation where our polls don't work, we can't rely on them, we don't know who's tampering with our election system, and you end up in some very, sticky situations. So in my own life, I've had to, with my wife Joyce, we've had a great many strategy sessions where it's like, how far do you go with this? How far do you push it? And I've I think, been fortunate enough to sort of know where that line is and not cross it. In the novel, Jimmy doesn't have sort of the inner resources to really deal with the situation that he's in. And like many people, he falls back on substance abuse because he can't really cope with knowing something and not being able to do anything with it. It tortures him to think, for example, that the whole history of the United States might have been very different if Al Gore had actually been the president coming out of that election. Stop and think about it. You have a family, heavily invested in the oil business and all of that, involved with Saudi Arabia, all of that. On the one side, who ends up president, on the other side, you have the most conscious environmentalist probably ever to reach that level of American politics. What would the history have been? What were the chances of invading Iraq if some other outcome had come? I mean, these are major worldwide, situations. And here's a lone, poor journalist who thinks, I know something about this, and I have a social obligation, a journalistic obligation to get it out there. And he's rebuffed at every turn. So it's not a good or bad thing. It's not that Jimmy's right and everybody's wrong. It's that these are the social forces. When you do this kind of work, this is the kind of social forces that play on you, that truly affect you. When you look at history, you just say, well, this happened on that date and that happened on that date. But history is really how individual people experience it and really live it. That's the story that's always captivated me. I mean, if you go back to a book like Dr. Zhivago, if people in the audience are familiar with the great Boris Pasternak novel of the Russian Revolution, you have the Russian Revolution, all the great army stories and all of that, White Army, Red Army, but it's told through this one man who's a poet trying to live his life as a society around him collapses. And this is a similar type of story, one person trying to get something out, thinking I can make a difference. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And in this particular story, I mean, he's not able to sort of break through all of those social forces and accomplish what he wants to. But I think if people read the book, they will see some of those forces that were at work that they really don't know that much about. Because when you're inside the sort of journalistic machine, I mean, that's what you experience. The news is what people choose to put on the front page or on the screen. There's a lot of other stuff that goes on that may not be on that screen or that front page. And that's part of the loss of the innocence and naivety that you have, as a journalist going through your life and doing this for about 40 years. So, I think the story, I mean, just from the things you're saying, I hope it's got a certain richness to it that's not simplistic, that's not black and white. I mean, Jimmy's very flawed, and he's meant to be presented that way. So, it's good to have your feedback on it.
Oh, yeah, and believe me, the richness of all of that certainly comes through. And like I said, I mean, I kind of kept going back and forth with all of the characters. I mean, there were parts where I really couldn't stand Jane. And I really kind of felt for Jimmy. And then there were moments, too, where it was just like, Jimmy, maybe put down that pint of bourbon and, have a little coffee and kind of, take a second look at this, get a grip. The richness of all of these characters certainly comes through in the writing, Stephen. There's one final little part that I wanted to get to, and then I'll let you go. But again, one of the main themes of In the Cards is that, and you say this in the book description, is that before before the Robert Mueller investigation and before the Russians hacked the 2016 presidential election, the Americans did it to themselves. And of course, the fact that nobody looked into Americans doing this to their own elections, this in many ways has laid the groundwork for what we saw in 2016 and what we'll probably see in the future unless something is really done. And I told you before in an email, I'm still not entirely convinced of like the sort of full-on Russian interference that a lot of people are kind of putting out there. But your novel did make me kind of think twice about some of this stuff, and it did make me think that you really don't even need the sort of like more conspiratorial, the Russians are behind everything and Red's under the bed, this sort of fear mongering that's going on amongst many in Washington and in other places. But as you see in the Cards, all you really need to do is target a few districts and counties in a particular state, and you can really kind of sway the outcome. And it did make me wonder, because, obviously the Russians would interfere with an election of ours. We interfere in their elections all the time. I mean, again, Bart is talks about meeting Boris Yeltsin, and that is probably one of the most rigged elections in world history. How this drunken buffoon got elected is, ask anyone in Russia, they'll tell you who helped put that into motion. And we also see that Burning House, this company, they don't really care who wins. They might have some political allegiances to one party over the other based on campaign contributions, but the impression I got, again, it's not black and white. Burning House, as a company in the book, I mean, they'd probably be willing to work with anybody, as long as they paid. That doesn't really concern them all that much. And as I said, it did kind of make me think twice about, completely writing off any Russian interference, because we really don't know. And there were some odd things. Greg Pallas is a journalist who's been writing about voter suppression and problems in the 2016 election. People can also look at Bev Harris, who wrote a book called Black Box Voting, which is all about Diebold, which is one of the major companies that produces these election machines. It is entirely possible. And again, you have to kind of take a step back and figure, if we're doing it to ourselves, why wouldn't someone do it to us? And it wouldn't have to be this grand conspiracy. All you could do is manipulate in a few counties, let's say, maybe a state or two. So it did kind of make me wonder. And, one question I had for you, Stephen, is, the media, why do you think the media reacted so differently in 2006 than they did in 2000? Again, in 2000, there was a bit more tangible evidence. I mean, we had the whole issue of the hanging chads. If people wanted to look into some of these companies that were producing the cards, I think they probably would find something. Whereas in 2016, I still don't really see like a smoking gun, yet the media reports every molehill as a mountain. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's because of the personal distaste for Donald Trump. I think that the incredibly intense focus on disliking him and he does interact pretty strongly with the media and all of that. So you can it's like some of these other stories, you can put a face on, call it evil. I'm not using that word, but I mean, anytime you can personalize it to that degree, you can motivate people much greater. People don't want to see Donald Trump as reflective of our culture. They want to see him as this total outlier, which I don't believe is true at all, but that's the way the media generally perceives him. He's this total aberration. He's this total, he's not one of us at all. I mean, he's perfectly reflective of all kinds of things in our culture, but we don't want to look at them. We don't want to see that. And so there's this incredible pushback, and there's this incredible, dislike of him as a human being. And I think that's motivated a lot of people. I mean, good things can come out of that. I think the problems are much bigger than Donald Trump as an individual. But if that can motivate investigative journalists to get off their butts and go do something, I'm all in favor of that. And I mean, I have long felt that one of the great ironies of the 2016 election, I'm not saying this is true or false, is that he really doesn't know what went on. He really doesn't know. He really truly believes he won totally legitimately. And 60 million people or so did vote for him. I mean, so he's not an outlier. He's appealing to a lot of things and a lot of people. But I think that's maybe one of the great ultimate ironies here, that he's absolutely kind of like Jimmy. He's a pawn in a much bigger game that's being played. And, Jimmy can't control it or get through it. But that's entirely possible from my point of view. And that would be rather outrageously ironic.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's one final thing, Stephen, and then I promise to let you go.
Okay.
But I only thought about this while I was reading your book, and I just wanted to get your take on it, this sort of idea or this theory. But we have to assume that if the Republican Party, or at least factions within the GOP, manipulated the 2000 election and presumably the 2004 and subsequent elections. We have to assume that on some level the Democrats figured out how to do this as well, and they were doing it whenever they could. And I wonder, and this is something that again it only came to me when I was reading the book, but what if what if the Democrats had rigged the election for 2016, or at least had manipulated certain areas through voting machines, and they were convinced that they were going to win, and and then instead the GOP manipulated other factors, and rather than admit that, well, I know you fixed this because we were going to fix it, the Russians are used as a smokescreen, that's a convenient way to blame somebody without without admitting to the American public that we've all been doing this for some time. Or let's say Hillary Clinton did nothing wrong, the Democrats were completely fine, but they knew that the GOP had manipulated voting machines or something like that. And rather than admit the really horrifying truth that we've been doing this since 2000, we use the Russians because, everybody hates the Russians. Right. And I just wanted to get your perspective on that, Stephen.
I've never thought about it from that angle. So to me, the overriding point was, if you can't trust your election system, it sort of undermines everything else. I mean, like the anecdote that you told earlier in Bay Ridge, I think I was hoping to get people to think about this, in a rather new way or large way, and to look at this piece of history. I haven't played out in my mind the scenario you just laid out. That's a little bit beyond me. But I think the very fact that you're thinking about it in that term shows me that, there's something worthwhile in the book. And that's why I wrote it. I mean, you're not going to get this story anywhere else. This story is not going to be told. I tried to tell it in other ways at other times for a long time, and I hope that I figured out a vessel to tell it through to get people to think about these very issues. So I hope that. Oh, well,
absolutely, and I think it's wonderful too as a novel. I think novels tend to reach more people. It's such a well-written book, Stephen. Again, you can go to Amazon.com and get the book on Kindle for just $4.99. So I hope the listeners out there and other people will read the book and it will start making them think. Like I said, I mean, I had never thought of it, the possibility I just laid out until I was reading your book. And it also raises a lot more questions about where we are as a society, the incredibly short attention span that the American public has. You can go from, they stole the election to we have to invade Afghanistan to Saddam Hussein is the most evil man on the planet, all the way up to where we are right now, where we're basically fighting over this, what Donald Trump said in 140 characters, while he was watching Fox News. So there's so much in the book. So I highly encourage people to check it out. Again, you can go to StephenSinglar.com as well, where you can find all of Stephen's books, and again, links to in the cards. Stephen, quickly, is there anything you want to leave the listeners with?
No, I think we covered it really well. Stephen is Stephen. If you go to it, singular Singular. A lot of people misspell my first name. So, I would also encourage people to go there and look at the books and see what you think. So, but I appreciate you exploring this in such depth, Pierce. It's a great thing.
Well, absolutely. And, again, anytime, Stephen, I love having you on the show. I love all of Stephen's writing, and I love, just chatting and throwing out these ideas. So, Stephen Singlar, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for sticking around for the second hour as well.
All right, Pierce. Thanks so much. I'll talk to you again.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Once again, thank you to Stephen Singlar. Again, the book is in the cards. You can find it on Amazon Kindle. I'll have links up in the show notes for the book, so you can go and buy it. And really, seriously, I mean, it's like $5 on Kindle. So there's no excuse. And I know some people say, oh, I don't have a Kindle, you can if you want. I mean, this is how I did it because someone recently or a few months ago stole my Kindle, but you can download the Kindle app on your phone and you can read it there. That's how I read it. I know that's like sacrilegious, and I felt very embarrassed while I was reading the book on my phone. But again, I read it in 2 days, so it was fine. Nobody, hardly anyone saw me reading a book on my phone. And as I was saying there with Stephen, there's so much in the book that gets your mind kind of working in overdrive. And I said I'm still not really convinced of this, dark Russian conspiracy. But that being said, when you read Stephen's book, and again, keeping in mind that this is a work of fiction, but obviously there is quite a lot of truth to this. Stephen was just sort of mentioning, he had tried to present a story like this or talk about this story of the 2000 election many times in the past, and nobody would take it seriously. So, it's not just a novel. I mean, there's obviously quite a lot of truth to this. It does make you think, and it does sort of give you pause when you look at what happened in 2016. And the thing that kind of got me was how close everything was in those final moments, and I'm sure many people will remember, because they were probably watching it live as I was, that moment where John Podesta came out on stage. Remember, Hillary Clinton didn't even come out that on election night. There was no speech because they really didn't know. And John Podesta came out and he gave this weird sort of, don't worry, we're going to fight this and we're looking into it and blah, blah, blah. And many of these outlets were sort of unsure. And we all kind of went to bed unsure of who really won. I mean, it seemed as if it was going to be Trump, but there was this sort of, this little, seed of doubt in there, just like in 2000. And I don't know, it really, reading in the cards, it does make you wonder, if not the Russians, then Trump, factions of the GOP. And it really, it did make me wonder if they can't admit that it's, say, the GOP or some other nefarious group, or maybe it's one of these companies like Diebold that was rigging this. And they can't admit that because, to admit that would be to admit that that American democracy is even more of a sham than we've already thought of it. So we have to go for the next best thing, the Russians. Who doesn't hate the Russians? There is obviously some shady stuff going on between certain people in Russia and the Trump campaign and the Trump administration. I know it's Russiagate is all part of the libtard fake news, but every day it becomes clearer and clearer that there is something there. And even was Sam Nunberg saying, he believes that there's something there. I know he's sort of walked back that statement after his wild time on, Aaron Burnett's show and a few others. But I don't know. It does kind of make you wonder if, there's sort of a shred of something there, or at least that, well, we can't, again, because to admit that it was them, how do you know it was them? Well, because we've been rigging elections too. Stephen briefly kind of touched on that in the 2012 election with Obama, that there was some weird stuff going on. So, to admit that is to admit that we've all known about this. We can't do that. So why don't we use the Russians as a smokescreen? And again, we know that there is some connection between Trump and, Manafort, Roger Stone, Lewandowski, and who's that pizza-faced idiot who was the energy advisor, Papadopoulos. There's something there. There's a thread. Now, it may not be full on, the Russians have sleeper cells all over the country in the form of Trump advisors, but you can kind of the best lie always has some truth to it. You need truth to make a really good lie. That's just sort of the basis of any good liar. There has to be some truth. You have to give people something tangible to hold on to. Otherwise, the whole thing is just going to fall apart. I don't know. It really did make me wonder if this is just a way for the Democrats to say, we know you rigged it, and maybe that's because we were rigging it, or we know you rigged it because you've been rigging it, but we can't admit that. And that this is really just sort of a covert way of going after that. So I don't know. That was something that popped into my head, and only because I was reading In the Cards. So again, I highly recommend people go and check it out. And again, to support Stephen's work, because he really does tremendous stuff, and there are so few journalists out there like him and Joyce, his wife, who are really actively pursuing this stuff. And again, the novel is such a wonderful way to present this, and it even made me think. I've been toying with the idea of writing something on the Epstein case, and perhaps a novel is an interesting way of going with that or looking into it. There's in the novel, I mean, there's a little bit more freedom, and again, you get to develop these like wonderful characters. Like I said, Bart Simmons is such a fantastic character, this larger than life oil executive. But anyway, I'll stop gushing and rambling on about Stephen's book. But again, I encourage people, go check out In the Cards, and I'm sure we'll have Stephen back on the show again soon. But there is, of course, lots of other exciting news going on. Oh, you know what? I mentioned earlier some Patreon stuff. I just wanted to kind of throw that out because I don't plug Patreon enough. But I do want to thank everybody who has been supporting me on Patreon. And I know I've seen a bunch of people have had to drop their pledges on Patreon, and some of them I see they pop back on, and I know money is tight and stuff like that. But really, if you appreciate the stuff that I'm doing, I really encourage you to go to Patreon, because between my day job and rent and bills and health insurance and everything else that's going on out there, I am at times struggling, and I love being on the show. It's therapeutic for me when I'm on the show. I know Ed talked about this recently. Anytime he's in a bad mood, but when he goes on the show, it always kind of lifts his spirits. And certainly, I'm in a much better mood now than when I was off air before we went live. When I was talking to Danny, I was just griping about work and all these things. So again, if you can support me, then I really do appreciate a lot of it. And again, if you want to continue getting excellent shows every week, guests like Steven Singlar and other people like that, then please, $1 a month is all I need. And anyway, I'm going to probably start. I'm going to change some of the goals on Patreon. I'm going to increase the amount that I want, because I feel like I'm kind of stuck at this. I'm hovering near one of my original goals, and but I do want to keep expanding the show, and I can really only expand it if people out there are willing to kind of chip in and help out. And this is something I've been meaning to record something on, but I'll do it here. But I'll try and maybe I can even just cut this audio out and put it in a little podcast. But I know that some of the levels that you can donate to on Patreon or subscribe to, they allow you to vote for future topics, and nobody has really kind of taken me up on that. So I'll kind of explain my general idea for that. But I do want people that are I think if you're at the $5 level, you get to vote for topics for me to cover on future shows. And I really do want people to be more involved with that. So that can kind of take a variety of different forms, and maybe we'll kind of tweak that and, work with all of the patrons and stuff and figure out how we want to do that. But certainly please start suggesting some topics to me. So if you're at the $5 level and you have some ideas, or you want me to cover a particular person on the show or an event, or you just want me to do a show on get my take on a particular theory or something like that, please email them to me. You can email me at porkinspolicy@gmail. You can tweet them to me. You can DM them. Of course, a lot of people, like to communicate through Patreon messages. Please do that. There's lots of ways to get a hold of me, but the people that are at that $5 level, send me your ideas for topics and stuff that you want me to cover, and then I think we'll depending on how many we get, maybe we'll whittle them down a little bit, and we'll pick 5 of the best, or if I get a lot, we can throw them all out there. And, maybe I'll create a poll on Twitter or something like that, or I'll just have you all, send me an email with your vote. And, whatever wins, that will be a topic on the show that we will cover live here on American Freedom Radio. I don't know if we'll do the full 2 hours on it, but we might, depending on whatever the topic is. But certainly, we will, it'll get a full hour of coverage on AFR. If the topic that you throw out there doesn't win, you can always resubmit it. There's some ideas. Maybe I was thinking of adding another another level to the Patreon subscribers, and perhaps maybe we could do something like a $10 a month, and you get to work on the episode with me, and maybe you get to guest host with me on a particular show that gets voted on, and we get to discuss it live. We can pre-record it, but it would be, I think it'll be a fun way to do a little bit more interaction with the listeners out there, get more people involved, and hopefully, get more subscribers. Because again, if you, the more money I'm getting through Patreon, the more time that I can spend on the show. If I'm getting enough, I wouldn't have to do my day job, and I could be on the radio show all the time. And there's lots of possibilities there. We can expand the show more. So again, if you like this, if you like the work I do, if you want to help me out, then please do go to patreon.com/Pierce Redmond. And also, first and foremost, please also support American Freedom Radio. Danny is a tremendous producer and an owner at AFR, and he allows me the freedom to do all of these types of shows. And I wouldn't be here. I probably wouldn't have the Patreon going the way it's going, which is really positive and is great, without the help of Danny and American Freedom Radio. So please also go to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, click on the donate button. You can give a one-time donation if you want to. You can become you can have it set up through PayPal so that you give a certain amount every month, and all of that helps. I definitely want to be on the radio show as much as possible. So please support me, and please support AmericanFreedomRadio.com, and please send me some ideas for shows to cover, because it also on one level, it also helps me, because sometimes, you don't have a guest, or you don't have an idea for a show. And this would be a really fun way, to produce some shows and have some stuff. And again, we can expand this as much as we want. We can have people, like I said, guesting, with me on a particular topic. We can record something separately. We can do, we can vote for Patreon podcasts, the exclusive bonus podcasts. We can do all those sorts of things, and I really do want to keep expanding this. So I hope that the listeners out there are also game and want to get involved as much as possible. But we still have 10 minutes, I believe, left, and I guess I just wanted to just quickly kind of I had some. Well, people may have seen this, but I tweeted about it. But Scientology has launched their long-awaited TV channel, and I believe it's just Scientology.tv is the website. where they're streaming live 24/7, I guess, Scientology television. And I watched a bit of it last night. Absolutely horrible. It is essentially just like a 24-hour long infomercial for Scientology. But definitely something to check out. It was funny too. Scientology TV last night, they launched at 8 p.m. That's when they went live with tons and tons of problems. I don't know if they were getting like denial of service attacks. I assume they probably were from some people, but I think it was also just everybody was wanted to check it out. So the server was crashing. They've since basically just put up the YouTube streaming because obviously that's just a lot easier. I just clicked on it right now, and it's the L. Ron Hubbard in his own voice, which is Scientology touts as a 3-part documentary series on the genius of L. Ron Hubbard. It is pretty horrible, and you're probably not going to be able to watch more than like 15 minutes of it, but it's worth checking out. If for nothing else, it just proves how with Scientology lately, it's like 1 step forward, 8 steps back. I mean, they should have launched this TV network years ago. And they probably would have been able to kind of control the narrative that they're attempting to put out there. But again, at this point, everybody knows Scientology is a joke and is a destructive cult. I doubt that anyone is really going to be checking out Scientology TV except for Scientologists. It is also on DirecTV, channel 320, if you're out there. And it's on like Apple TV, Roku, Fire TV, Android, I think Google, Google's app service. You can also get it through there. But it was funny because last night they premiere at 8 o'clock, and at the same time there was a documentary on ID, which is what is it? I forget. Independent Discovery, something. I forget. ID. It's like one of those channels. They do a lot of like the first 48 hours and crime shows and stuff like that. But they have a series there called Vanity Fair Confidential, which usually takes stories from editors at Vanity Fair, and they had one that also premiered at 8 o'clock on the disappearance of Shelley Miscavige. So very funny that Miscavige launches Scientology TV the same day that this big television documentary comes out on his wife Shelley, who hasn't been seen since I think like 2011, 2012 or something like that, maybe even earlier. I can't remember. The Vanity Fair Confidential episode was actually pretty awful in my opinion, and they for whatever weird reason they focused more on Lisa McPherson's death than they did on Shelley Miscavige. And Lisa McPherson is that case, if you're not familiar with it, is certainly one to look into. And there is a connection between the way that Lisa McPherson's death was covered up and the input that Shelley and David had on that did sort of contribute to Miscavige turning on his wife. But it just felt like an episode on Lisa McPherson. So why not just make that and then do one on Shelley? But anyway, very interesting. And the big sort of the big deal about Scientology TV that people were wondering is David Miscavige going to make an appearance? And lo and behold, he did. He looks horrible. The server kept crashing, and then it would just sort of go back like 2 minutes to the beginning of his little introduction. And it was funny only up until the point when you realize that Miscavige was probably losing it and, physically and emotionally abusing everyone around him, for this debacle, having the whole thing crash. But very funny, something to check out if you haven't seen that. And I bring that up only because I'm going to be speaking with our good friend John Atack, of course, the author of Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, and a member of the Open Minds Foundation next week. So we're going to be talking all about John's book, Opening Minds. We might even have some new news to plug between some projects that me and John are working on. So lots on the horizon. And thank you all so much for listening. Again, support me on Patreon, and I'll be talking to you very soon.
No rules, no taboo topics, no fear of doom, We are American Freedom Radio.
Simply Clean Foods is dedicated to providing the best quality food you can buy next to fresh from a farmer's market. Our stringent quality controls and absolute zero GMOs plus testing for heavy metals makes us unique in the storable foods market. Our line of fruits, vegetables, and meats are suitable for everyday use, and you won't have to worry about throwing away valuable groceries ever again. Take out the amount you need and reseal the package for use within the next 6 months. Simply Clean Foods' primary focus is to bring clean food to people all around the world and change the way we look at freeze-dried food in our daily cooking. Go to simplycleanfoods.net. That's www.simplycleanfoods.net today.
This is Rick Simpson, and you're listening to American Freedom Radio.
American Survival Wholesale is a proud sponsor of the American Freedom Radio. And when you purchase quality products from AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com, you help support this program. Our quality non-GMO foods do not contain MSG, high fructose corn syrup, or heavy metals. At American Survival Wholesale, you can choose from over 8,000 quality products, including self-defense weapons, bug-out bags, and long-term storable food at wholesale prices. We also have custom food packs available, including gluten-free, dairy-free, and vegetarian packs. If we don't have it, you don't need it. American Survival Wholesale is a veteran-owned and operated company which also supports our veterans in need, and we are very active in disaster relief. If you would like to become a distributor, please email us at bugoutamerica@usa.com or call 818-720-0759. We offer free consultations to answer all your questions. Do it today while things are calm. That's AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com.
Assassination. You know what's interesting about assassination? Well, not only does it change those popularity polls in a big hurry, but it's also interesting to notice who it is we assassinate. Do you ever notice who it is? Stop to think of who it is we kill. It's always people who've told us to live together in harmony and try to love one another. Jesus, Gandhi, Lincoln, John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, John Lennon. They all said, try to live together peacefully. Bam! Right in the head. Apparently we're not ready for that. Yeah, that's difficult behavior for us. We're too busy sitting around trying to think up ways to kill each other. Here's one we came up with. It's efficient, too. Genocide, you know? Killing large numbers of people simply because they don't look like you, they don't talk like you, and they don't have the same kind of hats you do. You ever notice that anytime you see two groups of people who really hate each other, chances are good they're wearing different kind of hats. Keep an eye on that. It might be important.
You're listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, the network who perseveres in delivering intelligent debate, constructive dialogue with true independence. The freedom to broadcast the truth is not free at all. So what is American Freedom Radio worth to you? The empowering information with fun, honest and pure integrity behind it provides an example to follow. Friendships to flourish with the moral altruism that pulls no punches. The hosts sacrifice and show remarkable discipline in their duty to deliver quality radio and service to the community with strength, wisdom, and loyalty. The founders of AFR wish to thank you personally for sharing your views and insights to make the best radio and alternative media. Now it's time for you to give something back and play a vital role in the future of America. Be as generous with us as we've been with you. Click on the donate banner at AmericanFreedomRadio.com or volunteer by emailing AmericanFreedomRadio@ymail.com. Vaccines, psychotropic drugs, and artillery batteries not included.
Launch sequence initiated.
We're now in the approach phase. Everything looking good.
prepare your mind to experience American Freedom Radio.